So, following in from this morning, we have got two more sessions this afternoon. So, I'd firstly like to introduce Andrew Cooper. So, Andrew is the founding director of Evora Edge, and he's got more than 25 years of experience as a commercial property and engineering consultant. And this includes working in the Valuation Office Agency and also Deloitte. Andrew's remit is far and wide. I think he does everything. So business development, digital twinning, building information modelling, and also building physics. I hope that's right, Andrew. He's one of the sector's leading experts on using modelling software for strategic asset management in the UK. He's also the author of the Building Physics module for the Energy Institute's Energy Management Professional Qualification. So over to you, Andrew. I shall let you introduce your topic for this afternoon. Thank you.
So the performance gap is widely talked about, certainly in my industry, and in the context of today's talk, I'm going to introduce you to that, why it exists, what it is, and why it's important to those of us that live and work in rural counties such as Shropshire, for example. I'm just waiting for it to come up, and then we can then go through it. So thank you. If we could go to the next slide, please, Vicky. Lovely, thank you very much. So I'll start off with a quick introduction to Evora Edge. What do we do, and why have I been invited to speak to you all today? And we will then quickly take a canter through what does it, what does net zero carbon mean, and in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, we're quite happy to accept the definition that's laid out in legislation by government. So we'll have a look at that, and then we'll consider the relevance of all that to rural counties. And I should say that my talk today is about commercial property, which is an area that we specialise in, although we do stray into domestic, so residential properties as well, particularly around heat networks, for example. And so focusing in on commercial, we'll consider the mechanisms that are being used to drive forwards the net zero carbon agenda. What is it that owners of commercial property are worried about? What is forcing them to make change, and how does that change manifest itself in terms of day-to-day fund and asset and building management? And then we'll have a look at this thing called the performance gap and why it matters, and we'll look at some of these significant challenges around net zero carbon, and these are gargantuan challenges. And we're going to talk a lot about money today. I'm afraid you can't disaggregate the subject of net zero carbon in the real estate market with money and with private finance, and we'll look at how that all works. And if I've got enough time, I'll then show some practical applications in terms of what we're doing in practice for our fund clients. So I'm also going to talk about something called NEIGHBOURS, which is an acronym for the, I'll try and get this right, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. Why have we introduced an Australian system to the UK? Can't we invent our own? And what's its relevance? And it's something I think that anyone out there who has a duty to look after commercial buildings, be that physically or be that financially, should be aware of. So we'll have a think about that and how that ties into the performance gap. So there's a little picture of me at the bottom there, only because NEIGHBOURS was championed by something called the Better Buildings Partnership. The Better Buildings Partnership is another collaboration between major property holders. So there are lots of them: Land Securities, British Land, Legal and General, all those type of entities subscribe to the BBP, and their purpose is to make buildings more sustainable. And they've been instrumental in bringing NEIGHBOURS UK, NEIGHBOURS to the UK, called NEIGHBOURS UK. And we are one of the few early adopters of with delivery partners for that methodology, alongside with much larger companies than ourselves. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few slides. If we could have the next slide, please, Vicky. Thank you very much. So Why am I here? Why is anyone here? Introduction to Evora Edge. So we're headquartered in Shrewsbury, and we're an SME. We're a small company. Depending on which day of the week it is, we seem to employ between 13 and 19 people, but there's between 13 and 15 of us that are sort of core staff, if you like, and we have various consultants that come in and help us around various projects. But we're very good at maintenance engineering, and that's quite a dull subject, but fundamentally we work in technical asset management, where we help deliver the technical aspects of ESG, or sustainability as we used to call it, and we typically do that for either directly for funds, so they will independently appoint us to work alongside the conventional asset managers, or we will be appointed by the conventional asset managers to help them with the technical delivery of ESG, of better, more efficient, more comfortable buildings. We have had to develop software to do it because it's quite niche and it's evolving very quickly. So we've developed our own prop tech, and that's working lovely for us now. And as I've already mentioned, we have set up a collaborative venture working with Creston University and Shropshire to give a physical location for anyone who's interested in sustainability. They could be a small company, someone looking to start out, or a much larger company just wanting to get involved in the conversation around sustainability in Shropshire, but in the surrounding counties as well, Herefordshire, and the counties generally that form what are referred to as the Marches region. So if anyone's interested in finding out more, I'd encourage you to get in touch with Vicky. But essentially we offer sort of no to low space. So, you know, for some entities it's free accommodation and support. You've just got to be engaged in sustainability. And that's part of our ESG policy. So please keep that in mind. In terms of the size of the company, so we are an SME, but in spite of that, we have significant responsibility, and it's that responsibility that's meant we've had to develop the strategies that we've developed and we've created. We look after about 150 assets. An asset could be an office, or it could be a shopping centre, but that covers in excess of 1.1 million square metres. So in old money, I think that's 12 or 13 million square feet, with an estimated capital value in excess of 3 billion. So there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders to get this right. In people's pensions in a small way, reliance upon that. Outside of that, we get involved in heat networks. We're currently looking at the business metrics. We're writing the business case for a substantial heat network in a major city. I can't say which one, but that would cover at least 20,000 homes and many more businesses. And we have done work for the public sector. We've advised Guildford Borough Council, for example, on its sustainability policy, and we specialise in the financial metrics. So we worked with them to identify, if you like, that equilibrium between sustainable development and development that's not cost effective, that will scare away developers. And that's our work was adopted by Guildford, so that now sits in their various policies around that. If we could have the next slide, please, Vicky. So, what does net zero carbon mean? Well, the UK is legally obliged to deliver net zero carbon through the Climate Change Act, which has been updated and amended as of 2019, and essentially that's 100% reduction against the baseline, and in this case the baseline is 1990. And interestingly, the Climate Change Act, or government, supports or advocates the use of carbon offsetting. So in simplistic terms, do the absolute best you possibly can, and with any residual carbon you can then look to offset. And offsetting is an interesting subject, so on the subject of carbonomics, but you've got statutory offsetting such as that found in planning and building regulations. So the London plan would require you to pay £95 per tonne of excess carbons over 30 years. So 1 tonne times 95 times 30 years. significant sums of money. So the question of carbonomics is going to become increasingly relevant through mandatory but also voluntary payments of offsetting, and we'll talk about that some more in a minute. But the targets were ramped up in terms of the trajectory under the 6th carbon budget, where we're looking to now slash as a country emissions by 78% by 2035. And these are gargantuan challenges, and I'll elaborate more on that as we work our way through these slides. If we could have the next slide, please, Vicky. So why does it matter? We're over here in Shropshire. Why do we care about all this? Well, Shropshire, it might be a rural county, but it has hubs. We're sat in one today, well, I am in Shrewsbury, where we have commercial buildings. People who live outside of these hubs come into them for work, but also people who live in the hubs, they go outside into industrial estates. So it covers commercial property in totality. And it matters because, and I've used Shropshire as an example, but the Shropshire portfolio, I've taken this off the website, I trust this is up to date, but it stands at about £640 million, and that income is used to deliver services. It might be used to prop up people's pension funds. It might form their pension funds. So fundamentally, a modern economy requires buildings, and buildings account for 40% of carbon emissions. So everything that happens in the huge cities is pertinent and directly transferable to more rural counties. There will be different types of challenges, but fundamentally the requirement to chase net zero carbon is consistent across the urban estate. If we could have the next slide, please. So what are the mechanisms that are being used to drive net zero carbon? Well, in my world, and rather distressingly, is these things called energy performance certificates. And an EPC is a prediction of energy consumption and resultant carbon emissions. So its primary metric is carbon, but it's based on standardized uses and idealized assumptions. And the reality is it's not going to save the planet. So they're not ideal. The best I can say about them is they're better than nothing. And they do offer the opportunity for us to collect lots of information on buildings that we can then use to try and save real energy and real carbon. There are two mechanisms that are relevant to the subject of EPCs. One is a European directive, which has been transposed into UK law. That requires you to have an EPC. You can't rent or sell a building. You can't market it without an EPC. And then the second one is what we just have shortened to MEES, minimum energy efficiency standards. And that says, having had an EPC, or if there is a requirement for an EPC, it can't be worse than a certain rating. And this is what the funds that we typically work for are really quite worried about. And I would argue Shropshire Council, Herefordshire, or any county council with large property assets should be particularly concerned about this, because those standards are going to increase. Government has made that quite clear in its white paper, in its consultation documents around the subject, numerous consultation documents, that currently it stands that if you have an F or G, it's difficult to let your building. They're proposing to ramp that to a C by 2027 and a B by 2030. So that's seismic. And if you've got hundreds and thousands of buildings and you're not often in control of energy, or you don't have insight into those buildings, how do you manage that risk? There are other mechanisms out there. There are operational ratings. Now, as an engineer, I much prefer these, but government, for various reasons, didn't. So rather than adopting DECs, another mechanism into the MEES legislation, they purposely chose EPCs. But so DECs are not really used that often. They're supposed to be used if you've got buildings that are accessible to the public, but if they're under 1,000 square meters, only once every 10 years. So where's the value in having an annual DEC every 10 years? The answer is probably got even less value than an EPC. Over 1,000 square meters, you ought to have them annually. So there's generally sort of a level of unsatisfaction in industry about where government has taken us on this subject, and which is why the Better Buildings Partnership looked abroad. They looked to Australia, where operational ratings have been hugely successful. They have transformed the built environment in terms of its energy efficiency. So while Australia as a country is digging up its backyard and selling coal to anyone who'll buy it, the irony is they're actually really good at running buildings. And the BBP has been working for many years now with the Australian government, the government of New South Wales, in fact, that owns the rights to NABERS, and they've now imported it initially just in offices, but NABERS almost certainly will probably expand to the full complement of asset types. And what's interesting is that government themselves is now starting to reference NABERS in its consultation documents. And in the launch of about 3 or 4 months ago, the launch was the kickoff speaker, as I like to think about it, was Kwasi Kwarteng, who then was the Secretary of State for BEIS. So there's enormous interest and there's huge appetite in industry to promote this as a viable mechanism for complying with MEES based on some of the propositions put forward by government. So other things that drive us for change, we've got building regulations. I touched upon that earlier. Part L requires the same software and the same calculations as EPC. So it's not real. It's on a Tuesday, all things being equal, this is how this building might perform. It's a guide, and it excludes lots of energy usage. So again, in the subject of net zero carbon, and we talk about carbon offsetting based on real carbon, potentially in the operational sense of the word, these are just really guides, but all of which are being brought together by government to try to deliver net zero carbon. So that the hope in industry is that we'll start to move away from this over reliance on EPCs, which is creating this thing called the performance gap, and we'll look at that on the next slide. And you've got other interesting things going on as well. So we've got voluntary environmental assessment standards. So BREEAM is probably the best known one in the UK and even in some parts of Europe. It's voluntary, but in many counties and cities, I can't build a commercial building unless I comply with BREEAM to a certain rating, so it's not really voluntary. But again, BREEAM assumes this idealized world, and you know, if you believe in climate change, and the science, from my perspective, is crystal clear, we need to start rethinking how we look and how we benchmark our buildings. I'll just quickly touch on this thing called GRESB. Unless you live in the commercial world, you might not have heard of it, but it's probably more so than any other instrument been a catalyst for change in the funds and the pension funds. When I say funds, I include pension funds in this. And GRESB is a benchmarking scheme for portfolios of assets to compare their environmental credentials annually against other portfolio of assets. And currently there is about 6.4 trillion US dollars of assets that subscribe to it. So most of your pension funds will have funds that subscribe to GRESB, and that has been a massive catalyst for change in the industry, and net zero carbon absolutely plays a part of that. We've seen a whole ream of financial mechanisms coming along about reporting of carbon for the larger companies. Mandatory, we've got streamlined energy and carbon reporting that's mandatory, but we've also got voluntary. So why would you want to voluntarily disclose your carbon emissions? Because the reality is business today is global. We're European, pan-European, global markets, and that's what's expected. So this sort of ideal of Brexit, and that's not a slur on Brexit. I know people who voted, good for them. But the fact of the matter is, you know, these funds and these entities are they're thinking European, global, and that's what they're doing in Singapore. That's what they're doing in Germany. So that's what we're going to do here, and that's how it works. And fundamentally, the biggest driver for change is you and me, and it's the small decisions we make about where we shop, how we buy, and where we invest. Where we buy our energy from. Do I want to move my money, my pension money, into a greener pension? And all that is creating a whole, massive change in industry, which we're having to grapple with. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is a great slide. So again, this is produced by the BBP, and this shows the real world performance of lots and lots and lots of buildings against their EPC assets. So A is extremely good, and G is golly gosh, that's ghastly. And what we can see, actually, there's not much in it. There are B-rated assets performing no worse or no better than C-rated assets, and D-rated assets. There's even G-rated assets performing better than some B-rated assets. So what we can quickly understand is that how I actually run my building and how much energy I really consume and how much carbon I actually emit has got absolutely nothing to do with an EPC. Yet, a key part of government's policy to meet net zero carbon, the very definition of it almost, is around these certificates, which are embedded in EPCs and in Part L, and there's a misunderstanding, I think, amongst many, that the act of having a good EPC is an equivalence to having a building which is potentially going to be net zero carbon. I think, in fairness to government, looking at its recent consultation documents, it's something that is increasingly recognised, but in no small part is because they're being told through entities such as the BBP and the UK Green Building Council and so forth. But so if you're a fund or asset manager, this is a huge challenge, because on one hand you've got to comply with MEES, or you might not be able to rent your building, and that will affect its property value. On the other hand, I'm now looking to take my business genuinely in the real world to net zero carbon. Many are looking to do it by 2030, and I've got to account real kilowatt hours and real carbon emissions. And how do I do that? And that's a challenge that they're all working to. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So I keep using the word challenge, and it is, but where there are challenges and where there are risks, there are also opportunities. So it's not all bad, but we've already discussed that there's this disconnect between the virtual world of EPCs and Part L and the real world, and why that matters. And I've already explained that industry is leading, but industry also not just has to lead in terms of direction, but it has to fund all this, and that creates other additional challenges about how do you identify internal rates of return around future savings or lack of savings based on energy efficiency, based on maintenance efficiencies, based on carbonomics, so the value of carbons, and where do you draw the line? So you might hear these terms: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 is, I think of a boiler, that's probably the best way to do it. So it's consumption on the site or production of heat on the site. Scope 2 is purchased electricity, is the best way to look at that. And then scope 3 is everything else. So from a business perspective, you can probably track your transport, but everything else, it becomes a bit difficult. And from a real estate perspective, those difficulties are amplified because fundamentally, if you've done your job right, you're not really responsible for maintaining that building. 90% of some of these funds will have what we call single let FRI assets, which means someone else occupies it and they run it and they pay the bills and they control how much carbon they emit. Yet the fund is responsible for reducing its scope 1, scope 2, and increasingly voluntarily putting themselves forward for scope 3, because it would be disingenuous if they didn't recognise that what they're producing and the market they're involved in is fundamentally responsible for up to 40% of global carbon emissions. So again, these are global issues, and the rural counties sit in that into that context. So although I think when people pass legislation around big property, commercial real estate, the instinct is to think of the cities. Fundamentally, any county, any area that has an economy requires buildings to put these to put their economy in and to operate from. And so this goes across the board. And if you're looking after value and you cannot rent and you cannot sell a building, or you can't rent it and then it affects the sale value, someone has to pay some money to make it rentable or lettable, then it all ties into the valuation considerations. So I've got 3 minutes. I've been whittling on, I'm quite good at that, but I'll just take a super counter through the next few slides, Vicky, please. So what do we do? Well, we try to translate, I guess, a target. So it could be it could be MEES, it could be what we call energy use intensities, the amount of energy consumed per meter squared, it could be carbon. It's for someone else to tell us what that target is. And we create through software 2 values. We create what we call a counterfactual value, and that is the existing cost of maintaining, repairing and replacing, but that's not going to deliver net zero carbon. And we then map out through modelling, energy modelling, 3D modelling, an alternative pathway that might comply with MEES, might reduce energy use and therefore might reduce carbon. And we calculate the cost differential, which is the difference in cost between the two. It's the cost at risk, we call it. So if they wanted to sell a building, a well-informed buyer might chip them for that price. And then we look at the energy savings alongside that. And that gives these funds and entities business case metrics to articulate net zero carbon and to plan for it over the next 10 years, because it's not going to happen overnight. If we can have the next slide, please. So we talk about carbon a lot, and again, this is a tool that we use to identify assets at risk because of carbon. The blue that you can see, that's bad. That represents a risk to the asset as a result of its operational carbon emissions based on a 1.5 degree science-based target. And so we know with this building that we need to at some point de-risk the asset. Well, I might not be able to rent it or I might not be able to sell it. So if I can have the next slide, please. So what we've done is we've worked out the year that the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, the building services and other things come to a natural life end, the end of their natural life. In that year, we're going to do some work. We've got real energy data, so we've used that to work out what we're likely to save, how much carbon we're likely to save. We've electrified this building, and as you can see, we've now taken it for a period of time out of that risk category. And these are the sort of tools that our clients are expecting. This is a tool you can go and use tomorrow. It's free. It's called CREM, and it's partly funded by GRESB, and I talked about GRESB earlier. So all of that brought together in half an hour roughly describes some of the challenges, the performance gap, and how our clients, including the public sector, are looking to tackle this seismic question of taking the real estate industry to net zero carbon. I think I'm on my 30 minutes, Vicky.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, I'm echoing on. Okay, so I do agree, risk and opportunities are definitely 2 sides of the same coin, Andrew, and I think any challenge, you know, is certainly an opportunity, without a doubt. Thank you very much for introducing us to the mechanisms that are really being used to drive net zero carbon, including white matters, the significant challenges, and also all those monetary implications that you talked about. I'm really interested to learn more about the heat network project at some point that you're doing. It's really interesting that, you know, heat networks have come up again and they've been talked about 3 or 4 times again today, but also how initiatives come round again and again, because, you know, we know they're not new, although the technology delivering them, some of them are new. So I'd be really interested in that, but also the fantastic acronyms that you introduced us to, you know, Carbonomics, Neighbours, BBP, CREM, GRESB. It's a whole new lexicology that I've gained this afternoon. I thought I knew a little bit about the built environment, but I clearly don't. So I've got a lot to learn, or maybe I should just stay in my area. And so thank you so much, Andrew, for your presentation. If you could stay on, that would be great, because we'll have a panel with yourself and Poppy around 2:30 today. Super. Thank you so much.